For as long as my kids have been alive, there have been superhero movies, a steady stream of superhero movies, all in an interconnected universe, showing them about what heroes look like. From Iron Man, the first in what we now call the Marvel Cinematic Universe, to a brand new one, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, coming out this fall, to a long list of new movies yet to be released, and TV shows and competing comic book universes. And some part of me, my inner nerd, is excited that as my kids have gotten older, we can watch those movies and those stories together. And now that they are getting old enough to watch comic book level violence kind of movies, we can watch Iron Man save the day, or Captain America punching out Nazis, or Hulk smashing, because that's what Hulk does. There's something cool about that. But I gotta be honest too. It's also getting kind of old. And I say that as a lifelong comic book superhero nerd who never thought he would get tired of watching new heroes with new themes and color schemes and powers and origin stories. It's kind of getting old to watch one hero after another gain some kind of superpower or immense wealth or engineering ability they use to smash and destroy things to save the day. In fact, I to be very honest, nothing against the new movies that are out in the theaters, but I went and took my son a week or so ago to go see the latest in the new superhero movies that was out. And as we watched this movie, I felt like I've seen this before. I've seen this story before. Person discovers they've got special powers, uses them to beat up bad guys, ends up winning the day by smashing their opponents better than the opponents can smash back. And when I say I'm tired of it, when I say I've seen that story before, it's getting kind of old, I don't just mean that they've run out of new stories to tell, or that it's cliche, although it's also that. But I'm kind of getting tired of seeing story after story after story that suggests the way to solve our problems, we human beings, the way to solve the what's broken in the world is to find somebody who's strong enough to smash everybody else. And if you'll only find the right person with a big enough weapon, or the most powerful, robotic suit, or the most powerful set of infinity gems they can put on their glove and do things with a snap of their fingers. If only we could do that, then you could force people to behave the way you wanted them. You could force things to be right. And it occurs to me, the stories we tell, even popcorn blockbuster movies that are meant to be entertainment, stories we tell say something about how we imagine that the world works. I mean, deep down, even though everybody knows that there's no such thing as Iron Man and that Tony Stark doesn't really exist with some super engineering ability to make weaponized robotic suits to help fight evil, even though we know there's no super soldier serum that can turn young Steve Rogers, the scrawny kid from Brooklyn, into Captain America to punch Nazis and stop Hitler, even though we know that, we keep thinking the way to solve things, the way to fix what's broken in the world, is more punching or blowing things up, or more threats at least. If we have more weapons, more powerful, high-tech ones, whatever the dangerous things are out there, we can destroy them and find victory. We tell this story over and over and over again. The superhero fad we're living through at the box office is just the latest version of telling stories that work that way, that we assume the universe basically runs on a whoever is the most powerful gets to set things right. And the way to save the day is to find a hero who is bigger and tougher than whoever else is around, and to smash them. And by your victory over them, dominating them, you can put things right. And I don't mean to be just beating up on our era. This is something we human beings have been doing from the beginning. In fact, in the world that Jesus lived in, those kind of stories have been floating around for centuries, and they were attached to the word or the notion or the idea of Messiah. That's a word that we just sort of throw around, or its Greek counterpart, Christ, which means anointed one, chosen one. In ancient Israel, that's a title of royalty for whoever is the one anointed, chosen by God to be the next king. And eventually, over enough centuries in Israel's history, it came to be this sort of hoped-for figure. One day God will send the Messiah, an anointed one, a chosen one, who will set things right. And as Israel and Judah and then the later returning exiles discovered, one empire after another had been whomping on them, from the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the Greeks and the Medes and the Persians, to, in Jesus' day, the Romans, that what people thought basically was, after facing one supervillain empire after another, what we need is someone who will be a God's anointed, chosen, hero. Someone who will be able to punch them back on their terms, who will destroy Rome the way Rome has stepped on us, who will conquer the way the Babylonians had conquered us once upon a time. What we need is a hero who can punch back the way we are used to seeing empires do. About halfway through the story of Jesus that we get in Mark's Gospel, Jesus turns to his disciples after having spent chapters on a sort of a roaming preaching and healing tour, going to local villages and sometimes going out to the outlying areas of Gentile territory, but healing people, speaking and announcing the reign of God and combating evil spirits everywhere he goes. He turns to his disciples and says, "What are other people saying about me?" And the disciples, they go to their list of heroes. They go, well, some people think you're like the prophets, like Jeremiah or Elijah, one of those prophets from before, or like John the Baptizer, who is that sort of loud, gadfly prophetic voice who got beheaded by the powerful people. Then Jesus turns and looks at this same community of his inner circle of followers and says, "What about you? What do you say about me? You've been closest to me. Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter, God love him, Jesus, inner circle disciple, looks at him without missing a beat, says, "You are the Messiah, you're the Christ, you're the one we've been waiting for." And what does Peter think he means when he says that word? Before it became like this title we apply to Jesus without thinking, like it's Jesus' last name, Jesus Christ. This is a loaded word that's got all the force of saying, like, I am Iron Man or I am Captain America. It's got this force, this idea of being tough and strong, and I will be the one who smashes down our enemies with brute force, raising up an army or commanding angel armies to destroy our enemies. Peter assumes something like that because he's seen real power at work in Jesus, and because he sees Jesus teaches and acts with authority like he really has come from God. When Jesus says to evil spirits, "Get out of here," they get out of here. When Jesus calls the dead back to life, they come back to life. So you can't blame Pete for thinking this is like Jesus' I am Iron Man moment. This is when Jesus comes on the scene and says, "I'm here to destroy empires and crush them with my amazing divine powers." As soon as those words, "You're the Messiah," escape Peter's lips, Jesus turns and goes, okay, don't tell anybody that. Why? Why? I mean, Christianity has based its entire existence for 2,000 years on the claim that Peter's right, that Jesus is the Messiah. But if all your life long, all you've heard are stories that make Messiah sound like Iron Man, sound like some ancient version of a superhero who will either raise up an army of human soldiers and overthrow the empire, or who will command supernatural, angelic hosts of armies and fight off the villains. If that's all you've ever heard, when anybody says Messiah, you're picturing a first century Avenger. You're picturing Iron Man. You're picturing Captain Israel instead of Captain America. And Jesus immediately wants to get his disciples to go, okay, everything you've thought about that word is wrong. Everything you've heard, assuming that God's way of solving the problem of evil by smashing it more, by violently killing one empire and replacing it with your own new one that you promise will do better this time. That's not how it works. That's not how God has come to set things right. God's way, God's reign looks like something different. So Jesus immediately turns the wording around, and instead of talking about himself as Messiah, uses a new phrase, a term that's less loaded. He uses the phrase Son of Man, which has its earlier reference earlier back in the Hebrew scriptures, but isn't quite as politically loaded, quite as a superhero kind of a title. It means something like mortal, like every mother's son, every child. Jesus is Son of Man, the human one, the one who really is human. Jesus says He's this Son of Man figure whose way of bringing God's reign isn't to smash or blow things up with missiles like Iron Man, but he will be rejected by the political powers and the respectable religious leaders, tortured, crucified, buried, and then rise from the dead. Well, this blows Peter's mind. He's like, no, you're Iron Man. You're the one we've been pitting our hopes on. You have to be successful. The empire can't succeed against you. And Jesus has to say to him, you're missing the point. It's not that I'm not the Messiah. It's not that God will be defeated by the powers of evil. It's that God's way of winning victory doesn't look like this. This is an old story. And we keep telling it even though it was never true. Jesus then says God's way of reigning, God's way of bringing what we sometimes call the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, God's way of establishing that isn't smash your enemies into dust and then set up a new empire on top of the rubble or their bones, but the power of self-giving, suffering love. That looks like an awful lot of good trouble if Jesus is going to get crucified, the shameful mode of execution the empire reserves for people they want to make an example of, and shunned by the respectable religious people. Jesus says God's way looks like the opposite of what you expect. Not wealth and power or military force or new weaponry or gadgetry or even Tony Stark-like intelligence and engineering ability, but suffering love that lays down its life, that absorbs the power of evil, that breaks empires by blowing them open from the inside and exposing how hollow they are. But that's not what anybody is expecting. But maybe that's exactly the story we need. Not only have there been superhero movies for as long as my kids have been alive, and for that matter, as long as I've been alive, we've been at war for half of my lifetime. For 2 decades. And for whatever good things or regrets there are about war, man, it means for an awful lot of our lives, and for people who are 20 years old or younger, all they've ever known is a world where the way we solve our problems is we keep blowing things up in other places, hoping that means we won't have to blow things up here or others won't threaten to blow them up around us. And it occurs to me, what the Christian community offers to the world is not a new superhero like Iron Man, but with a cross on him, but somebody who breaks apart that old storytelling and says it was always a lie. It was never the right story. God's way of saving the world, God's way of setting things right, isn't to send in a new, bigger, more powerful superhero, whether Iron Man or Hulk or Captain Marvel or pick one, but to endure the worst we can do and through suffering love, break it open from the inside out and create a new possibility, a new humanity. Jesus is convinced that's his way of saving the world, and that it doesn't happen by crushing your enemies, but by laying down your life to be killed by your enemies, by the willingness not to return evil for evil, but to absorb the worst that empires and respectable religious people can do, and to respond with the power of resurrection rather than of destroying and killing your enemies. It's a countercultural story, and getting it right, living that, is hard. It's especially hard in an era like ours where, to be honest, a lot of times we Christians assume life should be comfortable and easy for us and that we should have some kind of privileged position where nothing difficult or challenging happens. Jesus assumes his followers will be sent into a world where they're called to embody God's way of ruling the world in suffering love too. The shorthand for that is take up your cross. And before we turn that into, just something unpleasant I don't like. I don't like having to wear a mask. It's my cross to bear. I don't like being nice to strangers in the grocery store. That's my cross to bear. I have a sick aunt that I have to go and visit. That's my cross to bear. This is a loaded language when Jesus talks about it. When Jesus talks about carrying a cross, it's with the reality he will be lynched by the empire. And that an angry mob, goaded by the respectable religious people, will string him up and kill him on an actual cross. Because the Jesus way of reigning, the Jesus way of bringing the kingdom of God, it's a threat to every empire that has ever existed and ever will. Because it says, in the end, real power isn't about who you can crush or kill, but about how you bring life and how you do good, even for those who hate you, even for your enemies. That's radical. And it breaks apart all the claims of every empire, past, present, and future. It's hard to live that way of life, especially in an age that is used to being comfortable. But I want to invite you this Sunday as we gather in worship to explore what it might look like in our life, in this time and place, to be people who are done with that sad old cliche story of one new hero with one new gimmick who tries to smash the same old enemy in the same old way, leading to more money and more sequels, to instead embody something different, what the world is really aching for. The power of God that looks like a cross. The reign of God that looks like suffering love. The power that shows up not in destroying your enemies, but in rising from the dead once they put you to death, in order that all might be a part of God's new beloved community. That's powerful, and that's a story that is waiting to be told. See you Sunday.